Only I came to my husband's funeral. Not Richard, not Elena, not a single grandchild. Just me, standing beside Edward's coffin, while the sea wind from Portland swept across the courtyard of St. Augustine Chapel, cold enough to make the mourning flag by the window tremble, as if the weather itself refused to attend. The candle on the altar flickered, gasping like the last breath of a Maine autumn. The funeral director, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, looked uneasy. His gaze drifted from the empty pews to my face, the only one there. He cleared his throat once, then again, as if waiting for a miracle. "Mrs. Caldwell, would you like us to wait a few more minutes?" I shook my head. "No. Begin." Edward hated delays. He was a man of time. Chamomile tea at 8 sharp. The grandfather clock adjusted every Sunday. 5 quiet minutes each morning spent sorting the newspapers by date. Even on his last night in the hospital, he'd ask the nurse, "What time is it now?" Now he lay perfectly still, punctual for the first and final time. I sat in the front row. The 5 chairs around me stayed empty. The pastor read the scripture in a flat, practiced tone, like a weather report. The crimson maple flowers were arranged too perfectly. Their shine looked unnatural. The oak coffin gleamed too bright. Edward would have frowned. I could almost hear him chuckle. All of this is unnecessary. Then he'd glance around, half smiling, half impatient. "Where are the kids, Iris?" Where were they? This morning, a message came. Richard, my son, had sent a single line. "Sorry, Mom, client event. Can't make it." No call, no question about the service. I could picture him in a pale gray suit, champagne in hand, laughing among strangers, signing a deal while pretending not to notice that he had missed his father's last goodbye. Elena hadn't written at all. 2 days ago, she'd left a voicemail. Her voice light as mist. "Mom, I really can't cancel brunch with the brand partners. I'll stop by next week." Next week, as if the dead could wait. I never replied. After the service, I walked alone behind the pallbearers, past the empty pews, past the drifting scent of incense. I didn't cry, not because I felt no pain, but because grief had settled into silence. It lived in me like an anchor, pulling me down where water and time were one. The cemetery was nearly empty. Only an old groundskeeper watched from a distance, hand resting on a spade, his face blurred by fog. The coffin lowered. Soil fell softly. Wood touched wood. Silence pressed against my chest. I stood there a long while until the wind scattered red maple leaves across the ground. The headstone hadn't been set yet, just a wooden plaque that read, "Edward Caldwell, husband, father, forgotten." That last word stayed lodged in my mind like a splinter in a shoe. When I returned to the white clapboard house on Edgewater, the home Edward had built himself, window frame by window frame, the silence greeted me like a sound. His recliner still stood by the window, blanket folded neatly, leather gloves resting beside it as if waiting for a hand. On his desk, the silver pocket watch lay open, its hands frozen at 8:15, the minute he died. I stood there for a long time, then walked to the kitchen. I opened the cabinet, brewed a cup of sea chamomile tea, the kind he loved on foggy afternoons over Casco Bay. Its scent was soft, a little salty, a little bitter, like the air outside. I sat at the table, the cup before me, listening to the grandfather clock mark the seconds, each tick pressing deeper into the absence. Then I reached for my phone. I rarely scroll, but something in me insisted. On Instagram, Elena had posted 2 hours earlier, a rooftop photo with 3 friends, glasses raised mid-laugh. Caption, "Late brunch with the girls, bottomless mimosas, living our best lives." Sunlight flared on the glass behind her. Dozens of comments, glowing as always. My chest felt like wet paper. Too heavy to burn, too soft to fight. I scrolled again. Richard had posted too. A shot from the 9th hole, his driver glinting in the sun. Caption, "Deal closed. Perfect weather." He was smiling. the smile of a man who didn't know his father was gone. I stared until the screen blurred. Then I turned off the phone, took a sip of cold tea, and looked toward the wall. Our 45th anniversary photo hung there, Edward and me standing in the maple garden behind the house, sunlight threading through his silver hair. Now, outside the window, the branches were bare. "Tomorrow," I whispered, "I'll call Alan Pierce." Not to complain, but to revise the will. I would do it quietly, with the same discipline Edward lived by. Because if I was the only one who showed up for his final goodbye, then I would also be the only one to carry out his last wish, and ours. That night, I sat alone in our kitchen, the same room where Edward used to peel apples with a small curved knife, each slice identical, as if measured by a ruler. He always chose the brightest piece and offered it to me. "The one with the most sunshine," he'd say. Now, the fruit basket sat untouched, a few overripe pears collapsing under their own skin. The silence wasn't new, but tonight it had weight, contour, a shape I could almost trace with my hands. Edward had been gone nearly 2 weeks before the funeral, yet only now did the absence take form. I couldn't stop thinking about the empty pews in the chapel, about Richard's smile on that golf course, his self-satisfied caption. And Elena, laughing in that rooftop photo, glass of orange mimosa raised high, as if no one had just been lowered into the ground. I had raised a daughter who could sip champagne while her father was being buried. Had I failed her? Or had she lost something inside herself, something that couldn't be found again? Richard's message still sat in our thread, one short line, no punctuation, no breath of feeling. Client event. Can't make it. Is that how the new generation speaks of funerals? Just another calendar change, another canceled appointment. I wasn't angry, just cold. I poured another cup of tea, not for comfort, but to keep my hands busy. When silence becomes the only sound left, you do whatever you can to keep it from swallowing you whole. I walked down the hallway to our bedroom. Everything was as it had been. Edward's sweater draped over the chair, his silver pocket watch resting neatly on the desk. I opened the top drawer, envelopes, keys, his old stamp book, and a stack of documents bound with a rubber band labeled Estate EC. I set it on the desk and sat down. Inside were copies of our will, the list of beneficiaries, precise instructions, the Edgewater house, the cabin in Kennebunkport, the Harbor First Trust accounts. Every detail carried their names, Richard and Elena. They were co-owners of the house and shared the investment account of roughly $420,000, plus the lakeside cabin, the one they never visited anymore, except when tax season reminded them it existed. I read each line, the numbers trembling under the lamplight. My hands didn't shake from age, but from recognition, because I was holding a map that led straight to betrayal. I closed the file and rose, walked to the closet, and pulled down the fabric box of old photographs. Reunions, Christmases, birthdays, Edward smiling between 2 small children, me behind them holding a tray of pies, Elena tugging at my sleeve, Richard asleep in his father's lap, a book fallen open across his chest. We had once been a family, I thought, once. Maybe love doesn't shatter in storms. Maybe it fades like paint on a seaside porch, worn down by wind day after day, until one morning no one remembers the original color. I picked up a photo of Edward and Richard on the pier at Casco Bay. Richard must have been 12. Edward's hand rested on his shoulder, pointing toward something out on the water. His smile was gentle, steady, alive. That man deserved more than an empty chapel. I set the photo down and reached for the phone. It was nearly midnight, but I didn't care. I called Alan Pierce, our lawyer. The call went to voicemail, just as I expected. "Alan, this is Iris Caldwell," I said. "I need to revise my will, urgently. Please call me in the morning." I hung up and stood by the window. Moonlight spilled across the sea, pale and cold. Outside, the roses along the fence had withered since Edward passed. Not from neglect, but as if in sympathy. I knew I should prune them, give them room to bloom again. But not tonight. Tonight I let the old petals fall. Tomorrow I would begin cutting away everything that no longer belonged to me. Alan Pierce's office carried the smell of walnut, ink, and paper that had lived too long, that quiet, old-world scent of rooms that remember more than they reveal. Light from the tall bay window fell across rows of leather-bound folders, each labeled in the same patient hand. The faint tick of a wall clock blended with the hum of the radiator, steady and old-fashioned. It was the kind of room where time didn't move forward. It accumulated. Alan had known Edward and me for nearly 30 years. He handled our first mortgage, the deed to the Kennebunkport cabin, the life insurance papers, and finally the estate plan we'd signed together the spring before Edward's illness. He was the kind of man you could trust with secrets. Careful, loyal, allergic to small talk. In that, he and I were alike. He looked up as I entered, removing his glasses and setting them neatly beside a stack of ledgers. "Iris," he said, rising. His voice carried the slow gravity of someone who had learned not to rush through grief. "You're early." "This couldn't wait," I replied, lowering myself into the brown leather chair opposite his desk. "My coat still smells like the garden. I trimmed the maples this morning. Cutting the dead branches always clears my head." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes, but meant respect. I placed the file on the desk and drew out the folder labeled Estate EC. The rubber band snapped softly against the paper. Alan opened the first page, scanning, his pen tapping once against the desk. "I reviewed your note last night," he said. "You want to revise the entire plan?" "Yes," I said, my voice even. "Completely. Richard and Elena are to be removed from every clause." He stopped writing. "Are you sure?" "I'm certain." I watched the sunlight slide across the polished floor as I spoke. I buried Edward alone. No children, no flowers, not even a call. I kept telling myself they were busy, but what kind of life is so crowded that it forgets its own father? My fingers rested calmly on the edge of his desk. They don't belong in this estate anymore, not because of anger, because of truth. Alan nodded slowly, the weight of decades behind the motion. He reached for a yellow legal pad and began writing in precise, deliberate strokes. "Understood. We'll draft a full amendment and establish a new trust in place of the joint bequests. Who will be the beneficiary?" I hesitated, not from doubt, but from memory. "Lucas," I said softly. "Elena's son, my grandson." Images rose unbidden. Lucas kneeling in the garden, tightening the latch on the gate, his small hands stained with soil, his boyish voice asking, "Grandma, did Grandpa Edward really sail across Casco Bay?" He had that look children sometimes lose too early, the kind that believes work and kindness are their own reward. "He's the only one who still visits," I said. "Not for money, not for help. Just to check the locks, rake the leaves, bring me books he thinks I might like." Alan's pen paused. "And you want the assets transferred to him?" "Yes. I want an irrevocable trust. He'll inherit the Edgewater house, the Kennebunkport cabin, and what remains in the Harbor First accounts. But the trust must be protected, completely, from his parents." Alan leaned back slightly, studying me over the rim of his glasses. "That can be arranged. We'll call it the Lucas Caldwell Trust, irrevocable, managed by an independent trustee. Disbursements only for education or medical expenses until he turns 30. I nodded. "Name it the Red Maple Trust instead. Edward would have liked that, something grounded, with roots that hold through storms." Alan smiled faintly. "A beautiful choice, enduring but gentle." We spent nearly an hour moving line by line through the new document. From the Edgewater deed to the investment schedules, from the Kennebunkport cabin appraisal to the insurance endorsements. Each clause had its number, each signature its weight. I initialed the margins in steady ink. The sound of the pen against paper echoed like a heartbeat in the still room. When you've stood alone at your husband's funeral, there is nothing left in this world that can make your hands tremble over legal paper. When we finished, Alan capped his pen and sat back. He studied me for a long moment. "Iris," he said quietly, I've done this for 40 years, and I can tell you, it's rare to see someone your age this decisive. Most want to forgive, to keep the peace. I met his gaze. I've kept the peace for 70 years, Alan. It saved no one. It only let things rot slower. He said nothing, only nodded once, solemn, understanding. Outside, the sun had lowered behind the courthouse dome, painting the windows in amber and dust. When I stepped through the front doors, the air hit my face like clean linen. October in Portland carried that peculiar mix of salt and wood smoke, a scent that meant endings. I stood on the steps for a while, listening to the faint rhythm of waves beyond the city noise. Somewhere, a church bell rang 4 times. A gull passed overhead, its shadow cutting briefly across the sidewalk. I wasn't sad, and I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply finished. Finished believing that children eventually understand what they've refused to see. Finished writing checks signed with affection and receiving silence in return. Finished confusing obligation with love. I walked down the damp sidewalk, heels tapping softly against the stone. The street shimmered faintly with mist, and for a moment the world smelled exactly like Edward's aftershave, cedar and salt. It caught me off guard, then passed. A young woman walked by, holding her son's hand. They laughed about something small, their voices bright against the gray. I didn't envy them. I simply watched, as one might listen to a song once loved, still beautiful, but no longer mine. That night, I slept without leaving the lamp on. No music, no soft hum of the radio, no folded cardigan of Edward's waiting on the chair, as it had when he was in the hospital. The silence was still there, but it no longer hurt. It simply was, like the sea after a storm, smooth again, but forever changed. Down the hallway stood the filing cabinet, 3 drawers, each labeled in Edward's careful handwriting: home, taxes, family. The last one was mine. When I pulled it open, the metal groaned, a reluctant sound, as though the past itself resisted being touched. Inside lay neat stacks of folders, receipts, checks, bank statements, old Christmas cards pressed between contracts. I had kept everything, not out of fear of loss, but because I believed in clarity. Paper doesn't lie, and that drawer held enough truth to light a forest. I carried the files to the kitchen table, their weight familiar in my hands. I set aside the one labeled Richard, Projects and Investments, and then opened Elena, Housing and Living. My own handwriting greeted me, still straight, still careful, only trembling slightly with age. I turned the pages. A check for $15,000? 2003. Mom, I just want a small ceremony. That small ceremony had French wine, a live band, and a 3-course seafood dinner. $7,800, 2007. Roof is leaking. Lucas caught a cold. I wired the money that same morning. $12,000, 2011. New semester for Lucas. $5,000, 2013. Summer program in New York. Great for my portfolio. A year later, she called crying about a mortgage late notice. I sent $20,000 more. No questions. She'd said, "You're our anchor, Mom. We're so lucky to have you." And I believed her. Richard's folder was thicker. $25,000 for a can't-fail event project that vanished within 6 months. A car loan, a few MBA tuition receipts, hospital bills for his second daughter. When the IRS sent warnings, I wrote the check so he wouldn't face the consequences. Looking at each line, each signature, each trembling figure under faded ink, I realized how long I had been their safety net. They had never refused my money, but they had refused to come to their father's funeral, and there is no receipt in the world that can balance that debt. I stacked the folders back into the drawer, all but one, a plain envelope labeled Lucas. Inside, a folded piece of notebook paper, child's handwriting in pencil. Dear Grandma Iris, thank you for teaching me to draw. I think you're the smartest person I know. Someday I'll build you a house that's really beautiful. He was 11 when he wrote it. He's 20 now. I don't know if he remembers, but I do. I used to believe in fairness. that everything should be shared equally. But what if fairness isn't about dividing things evenly? What if it's about giving to the one person who saw you as human, not as a wallet? Edward once told me, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's who you leave it to." Back then, I thought he was talking about money. Now I understand, he meant honesty. That evening, the house looked smaller, not because it had changed, but because I was finally seeing it clearly, without the fog of memory softening its edges. For years, I had kept every gift from my children: wooden picture frames, handmade cards, porcelain mugs with their names. But love doesn't live inside objects. It lives in actions. And their actions had told me exactly what I was to them: useful, not precious. I spent the afternoon filling 3 cardboard boxes with those gifts, not to throw them away, just to make space for something else, something new. That night I didn't pour wine. I didn't need courage anymore. I brewed sea chamomile tea, Edward's favorite. The scent drifted through the kitchen, soft and faintly briny, merging with the whisper of wind from the bay. The tea leaves swirled gently in the pot, settling only when the water cooled, the way peace finally settles after years of noise. I sat by the window, watching the tide pull against the moonlight, and thought how truth, like the sea, never stays buried for long. I carried the pot of sea chamomile tea into the living room and set it on the low table beside the armchair near the window. The air still held that faint floral salt scent, mixing with the faraway hush of waves. For the first time in weeks, something close to peace moved through the house, quiet, weightless, and real. The call came just after noon, a voice I hadn't heard in months, hesitant but sincere. "Grandma, it's Lucas." I closed the ledger I'd been reviewing, the cabin expenses from Kennebunkport, the last of the automatic payments I was canceling. That place, which Richard had once called a strategic asset, was now just wood and silence. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, keeping my tone steady. "Are you doing all right?" There was a pause. Then Lucas spoke again, his voice unsteady. "I just heard about Grandpa. I'm sorry I didn't call sooner." I waited, not out of anger, but because I needed to hear what lived beneath those words. "Mom didn't tell me," he said at last. "She said he was still in the hospital. I only found out when one of her friends mentioned the notice in the paper, and I—" His voice broke. I answered quietly, "He's been gone almost 3 weeks, Lucas." "I know." A pause. "I'm sorry." Neither of us spoke for a while. In that silence, I heard something genuine, a grief that didn't perform, that didn't try to please. "I'd like to come see you," he said finally, "if that's okay." "Of course," I said, "come." He arrived an hour later, taller than I remembered, broader in the shoulders, his hair darker now, but his eyes, Edward's eyes, clear and earnest. He smelled faintly of laundry soap and ocean wind. He hugged me awkwardly, the kind of hug young people give when they aren't sure if they're still welcome. One arm tentative, then both, tighter when I didn't pull away. We sat in the living room. I poured him tea. He looked around the room that had once been his childhood playground, now polished, rearranged, quieter. "I missed the funeral," he said softly. "I'll never forgive myself for that." "You weren't the one who chose to miss it," I replied. He looked up sharply. "Mom really didn't come?" I nodded. He dropped his gaze, tracing the edge of the coaster with his finger. "She told me everything was handled. I should have known better." "Now you do," I said, "and you're doing the only right thing. You're here." He nodded, the motion small, full of understanding that needed no words. After a while, I stood and went to the writing desk. From the top drawer, I took a brown envelope, the one I had sealed that morning. Inside were the finalized papers for the Red Maple Trust, the signatures, the schedules, the trustee clause, everything ready, waiting only for my initials and his. I handed it to him. He opened it, brow furrowed, scanning the lines. "Grandma, what is this?" "My plan," I said. "The Edgewater house, the Kennebunkport cabin, the harbor first accounts." His head lifted sharply. "But why me? Why not Mom or Uncle Richard? I looked at him, steady. Because you're the only one who came back, without being asked. He sat still for a long time. The light from the window caught in his eyes, and they shimmered. I don't know what to say, he whispered. You don't need to say anything, I told him. Just remember who you are, and remember what love looks like when it's real. He turned away, wiping his eyes on his sleeve, exactly as he used to when he was small and embarrassed to cry. We stayed like that, quiet, breathing the same air, the same silence. But this time, silence wasn't emptiness, it was connection. A thread stretched across years and choices, fragile but unbroken. When he rose to leave, Lucas paused at the door. The afternoon light poured through behind him, painting his outline gold. Grandma, he said, if I come this weekend, can we paint the maple trees again? The ones behind the house? For a moment, the world seemed to tilt back toward life. I smiled, a full, gentle smile I hadn't felt in weeks. We'll use the best maple syrup we have, I said. He laughed, a sound like sunlight through glass. Then he was gone, and the house held that laugh for a long time after. I sat back down in the armchair, the cup still warm in my hands, and thought how strange it is that peace often arrives not with closure, but with continuity. The sound of waves filled the quiet. Outside, the first maple leaf loosened from its branch and began its patient fall toward the earth. Elena arrived the next morning. I had known she would, not from intuition, but from silence, mine. Silence has a way of summoning those who can't stand it. Her white SUV came too fast up the gravel drive, scattering red leaves across the porch. The tires screeched before the engine stopped, as though even her car was impatient. She didn't knock. She never did. The door opened, and the chill rushed in with her perfume. "Mother," she said, breathless but controlled, dropping her leather bag onto the table as if the house still owed her space. "I've been trying to call you." I didn't rise. I was folding the linens, Edward's winter blankets, the ones that still smelled faintly of cedar and soap. My hands moved slowly, deliberately, as though neat corners could steady the air between us. "I've been busy," I said. Her brows arched. "Busy? Doing what?" I didn't answer. She took the pause as invitation, walking farther in, her heels clicking across the oak floor, echoing like small hammers against patience. She poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher, leaned against the counter as if the kitchen were still hers. "So," she began, eyes glinting, "is it true?" "What is?" Her nails, polished to mirror brightness, tapped against the glass. "Lucas told me you're changing the trust, cutting Richard and me out." I folded the last pillowcase, smoothing the seam flat. "That's correct." Her laugh was short, brittle, and perfectly rehearsed. "You can't be serious. After everything we've done for you?" I looked up. "Everything? You make it sound like we abandoned you," she snapped. I laid the pillowcase down, one motion, calm as prayer. "You didn't come to your father's funeral, Elena. Not a flower, not a call, not a word." Her mouth tightened. "I had obligations, the collection launch. You remember that." "I do." I let the words hang a moment, quiet but heavy. "And I remember the photo you posted that day." Her face stilled. For a moment, I saw the child she once was. The flicker of guilt before pride sealed it away. "You want to talk about what you've done for me?" I asked. "You sent me invoices, credit card balances, tuition bills, and I paid them all, quietly, without complaint." "That's what families do," she shot back. "They help each other." "No." My voice was even. "That's what mothers do, and I've done it long enough." The words landed between us like the slow closing of a door. "Your father built this house with his own hands," I continued. "He didn't have much, but he had pride. He taught that respect lives in action, not in words, and you couldn't give him 2 hours of yours." She looked away, down at the floorboards that Edward had sanded smooth. The silence after that was sharp, alive. "So you really erased our names," she said finally. Just like that? Not just like that, I replied. I spent 20 years giving, expecting nothing. I buried my husband alone. I waited for my children. No one came. That isn't just like that. That's a lifetime. Her arms folded tightly across her chest, armor over regret. You're punishing us. No, Elena, I'm freeing myself and giving everything to Lucas. I didn't answer. The clock ticked once, twice. She laughed again, higher now, cracked at the edges. He's barely out of school. He knows how to show up, I said. The words quieted even the clock. For a moment I thought she might cry. Her lip trembled, but pride, as always, won. She reached for her bag, slid on her sunglasses though the room was dim. I hope this makes you feel powerful, she said. No, I answered. It makes me feel at peace. She turned, her heels clipping against the floor, a metronome of retreat. The door closed. Gravel shifted outside, then only wind. I waited until the engine sound vanished down the hill. Then I lifted the red maple trust folder from the table and set it beside the folded linens. Through the window, the light changed. Late morning, cool and gray. The maple leaves outside trembled like small red hands letting go. That evening, when the house was still, I found an envelope shoved under the front door. No return name, no seal, just folded paper, creased in haste. You don't understand how hard it is to keep everything balanced. We tried. Maybe we failed, but erasing us isn't the answer. I read it twice, then once more, slower. The handwriting was rushed, defensive, half apology, half accusation. I folded it cleanly and placed it in the drawer labeled miscellaneous. Now it was only paper. Too little, too late. Paper doesn't change the past. It only preserves the evidence. Richard came the next afternoon. He didn't storm in like his sister. He knocked twice. Then, after a pause, a third time, lighter. When I opened the door, I already knew he wouldn't come alone. Behind him stood Meredith, his wife, wrapped in a scarf, worth more than my first car. Her smile was polite, her posture perfect, her eyes hollow. She gave me the kind of nod people learn in corporate meetings, half respect, half obligation. "Mother," Richard said, his voice calm, carefully rehearsed. "May we come in?" I stepped aside. They entered as if walking into an inspection, their cologne trailing through the hallway, heavy and foreign. Richard still carried that blend of charm and discomfort, a man who'd learned to apologize with posture. He looked around the living room, at the photos he no longer remembered being part of. Meredith stayed standing, clutching her handbag like a passport. "Would you like some tea?" I asked. "No, thank you," she said quickly, as though accepting would be dangerous. Richard cleared his throat. "Elena called me. She's upset." "I imagine she is," I said. "She said you've rewritten the estate plan. Is that true?" "It is." He nodded slowly, like someone rehearsing empathy. "Mother, we just wish you'd talk to us first." "You mean before you forgot us?" I asked. His mouth opened, then closed. Meredith spoke up, voice smooth as glass. "We're not here to argue. We only want to understand." "Understand what?" I asked. "How a funeral works? How silence feels?" Richard's jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "Neither was leaving your father's coffin unattended," I said quietly. The room breathed once, then held its breath. "I made mistakes," he whispered. "We all did," I said. "Some we can still fix, some we can only accept." He looked toward the window, where the afternoon light trembled over Edward's old chair. "I just wish you'd told us sooner," he said. "I did," I replied, "in ways you never listened to." No one spoke again. Meredith shifted her bag, murmured something about an appointment. They left soon after, their car humming away down the same gravel road. When the sound was gone, I stood in the doorway a long time, breathing the salt in the air. For years I had mistaken distance for dignity, but sometimes dignity is simply the choice to stop explaining yourself. He looked around the house the way people do in museums, careful, reverent, detached. as if the rooms belonged to a life he once visited but no longer inhabited. I led them to the living room. They kept their coats on. "I heard from Elena," Richard began, "and from Lucas." "I guessed as much," I said. He cleared his throat, trying to steady a tone that had long forgotten sincerity. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." I said nothing. Meredith crossed one leg over the other, perfectly composed. The diamond on her finger caught the late afternoon sun and scattered it across the floor like a silent assertion of value. "We understand this is a sensitive time, Iris," she said, her voice soft but coated in diplomacy. "Emotions can be unpredictable after a loss." I met her gaze. "You also didn't attend Edward's funeral." She blinked once, not missing her rhythm. "I had a meeting with investors in New York. It couldn't be rescheduled." Richard shifted in his seat. "Mother," he said quietly, "I know I should have come. I should have called. But honestly, I didn't know where to begin. I thought maybe—" "No," I interrupted. "You thought if you stayed silent long enough, the pain would belong to someone else." He looked down, the words landing heavier than he expected. "I waited," I said. "I sat in the room your father built, board by board, with his own hands. When they lowered him into the ground, not one of you was there." Richard's mouth opened, but Meredith touched his knee, a signal both subtle and practiced. "Let her speak," she murmured, then turned back to me. "We understand this has been traumatic, and you absolutely have the right to amend your estate," she continued smoothly. "But please think carefully. Lucas is very young." "He's 19, I said. "Yes," she replied, smiling faintly. "But he's inexperienced. He doesn't know how to manage a trust. He doesn't understand legal complexities. He could be taken advantage of." I raised an eyebrow. "By whom?" She didn't blink. "By anyone who knows he's inherited something valuable." "Like you," I thought. Richard leaned forward, his voice small. "Mother, I know I haven't been the best son, but this feels extreme." "No," I said evenly. "Extreme is abandoning your father. Extreme is living as though the person who gave you life is replaceable." He swallowed hard, said nothing. "So that's it then?" he asked finally. "No," I answered quietly. "You cut the cord long ago. I'm only acknowledging it." Meredith stood, her smile gone. "This could become complicated, legally speaking, Iris." I didn't flinch. "It won't. The papers are finalized. My attorney is competent, and I've had plenty of time to think." Richard looked at me for a long moment. There were gray threads along his temples now, grief's fingerprints perhaps. "I used to think you forgave everything," he said softly. "I still do," I replied. "But forgiveness doesn't mean an open door." Neither of them spoke. They stood, thanked me with empty courtesy, and left. When the door closed, the house fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own pulse. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from release. I sat by the window, watching the maples outside. Light withdrew from the walls, inch by inch. The last red leaves spiraled downward, like quiet verdicts. Winter was coming. Edward would have said, "They'll bloom again, darling." He was always right, just not about everyone. The next morning I walked into Harbor First Bank. It smelled faintly of lemon floor polish and the kind of quiet reserved for places where large sums move invisibly between signatures. I hadn't been there in nearly a year, yet the receptionist recognized me the moment I entered. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, standing immediately. "Mr. Jansen will see you shortly." I nodded and stood by the tall window overlooking Exchange Street. Outside, people hurried through the wind. Inside, the air waited, thick with the stillness of unfinished business. A minute later, Mr. Jansen appeared, silver hair, gray suit, the calm precision of a man who never spilled his coffee or his secrets. "Iris," he said, shaking my hand. "I admit, your message surprised me." "Surprise is good," I replied. He smiled slightly and led me into his office. Glass walls, walnut desk, one photograph of a hunting dog beside a pot of orchids. Edward would have liked that. honesty amid calculation. "I understand you want to make adjustments to your accounts," he said, opening the file. "No," I answered. "They're already done. I just need to confirm there are no delays." He scanned the notes, eyebrows lifting. "You've rescinded all linked transfers, removed Richard and Elena as beneficiaries, and established an irrevocable trust in Lucas Caldwell's name. That's a significant change." "Yes," I said. "It is." He looked up, studying me, not judging, just measuring the resolve behind my calm. "Most people your age prefer to keep flexibility," he said gently. "Reversible clauses, contingencies." "Flexibility," I said, "is for people who still owe explanations." He nodded once, understanding. Outside, the city kept moving, taxis flashing yellow beneath bare branches, a boy carrying coffee cups across the street, unaware that someone above him had just rewritten the future. Mr. Jansen slid the confirmation page toward me. "Your signatures are valid. The trust is active as of this morning. Lucas Caldwell is now the sole beneficiary." I took the pen, steady this time. "Good," I said. He hesitated. "If I may ask, what changed your mind?" I looked out the window again. The sky had turned the color of pewter, the kind that holds both storm and peace. "Nothing changed," I said. "I just stopped pretending it might." I signed the final page. The pen made that faint, irreversible sound ink makes when it declares something finished. When I stepped back into the cold, the air tasted different, cleaner, lighter. A flock of birds turned in the distance, a single synchronized motion heading south. That's a significant shift. "I'm a significant woman," I said. "Richard, Mr. Jansen," let out a soft laugh. "Yes, Mrs. Caldwell, I can confirm that." I leaned forward slightly. "Then let's make sure every safeguard is locked in. Steel tight. No appeals, no family representation sneaking in 5 years from now when they finally realize what they've lost." He nodded. "We can reinforce the Red Maple Trust to guarantee that. Disbursements will be limited to education, housing, or medical costs until Lucas turns 30. After that, full control, but with a protective tier that remains in place. Would you like to appoint a co-trustee?" "No," I said. "He can hire an advisor if he wants, but the choice is his. I trust him more than I trust any attorney." It wasn't an insult. It was the truth. Mr. Johnson adjusted his glasses. "You understand. This is irreversible." "I'm not planning to reverse it." We reviewed everything. Signatures, dates, the final confirmations. It felt less like paperwork and more like rebuilding a foundation, not for a house, not for a company, for boundaries, a structure made of quiet and self-respect, one that wouldn't crumble under guilt or sentiment. Before I left, he clasped his hands. "If I may ask, Iris, are you doing this out of anger?" I thought for a few seconds. "No," I said. "Out of clarity." He nodded slowly. "That's rare." "No," I replied. "It's just late." When I stepped outside, the afternoon light had turned to gold, bright enough to sting. The air felt different, sharper, lighter, clean, like something rinsed of memory. Across the street stood the cafe where Edward and I used to sit after errands, sharing a single cinnamon roll and the newspaper. I hadn't been inside for years. It had changed. New baristas, louder music, but I still went in. Old habits deserve a proper farewell. I ordered a cappuccino, took a seat by the window. Outside, people moved with that weekday urgency I no longer envied. A young woman pushed a stroller past, her coat billowing, her expression a blend of exhaustion and resolve. I took a slow sip. No phone, no list, no role to play, just coffee, a chair, and an hour that belonged entirely to me. People say age brings peace. They forget to mention how loud peace can be, how it fills every space where apology used to live. Lorraine Campbell lived 2 houses down, since 1972 to be exact. We never called each other best friends, but we'd shared enough cups of tea and exchanged enough glances over the fence to understand that silence between certain women can be its own fluent language. She knocked at 5, holding a tin of lemon butter cookies and that knowing look neighbors carry when curiosity outweighs manners. "I saw Richard's car here yesterday," she said as soon as I opened the door. "Did he bring flowers or arguments?" "Neither," I said, stepping aside. "Just his wife and a folder." "Oh." One syllable, but heavy enough to serve as a verdict. We sat in the living room. I brewed 2 cups of tea, sea chamomile for her, strong black for me. She placed the cookie tin between us, unopened. She was waiting. "I told them," I said evenly. "They're out of the trust. Lucas is the only one who came back without being asked." Lorraine exhaled, long and low. "About time." I looked up. "I'm sorry, Iris," she said more gently, "but I've watched you chase their approval for years, scheduling your checkups around their vacations, writing checks while they bought new cars, smiling when they forgot your birthday. I kept thinking, one day she'll stop." She reached for her cup. "Thank God you finally did." "I didn't stop," I said. "I just let go of everything that wasn't love." She smiled, slow and warm. "That's a fine way to put it." We fell quiet, the hum of the refrigerator, the wind brushing the porch rail, the faint rhythmic drip from the teapot. Autumn was retreating, its smell of dry leaves and soft endings settling through the house. Lorraine glanced at me again. "So, what now?" I looked toward the window, where the last light slipped through the branches like a promise that didn't need witnesses. "Now," I said, "I keep the quiet, and I guard it." That evening, as dusk deepened, I walked onto the porch with my cup of tea. The air had cooled, the sky brushed in slate and rose. Across the yard, the maples stood bare except for one stubborn leaf trembling at the top. I thought of Edward, his calloused hands, his laughter filling these walls, his quiet certainty that goodness returns in its own time. Maybe it does. I watched the final leaf break free, spiral once, and drift down into the soft dark. For the first time in years, I didn't reach to catch it. "Do you regret it?" she asked eventually. I shook my head. "I regret not doing it sooner." She opened the tin finally. The shortbread was perfect. Crisp edges dusted with sugar, buttery and soft in the middle. We each took one and chewed thoughtfully. "You know," she said, "my niece tried to get me to sell this house last spring. Said it was too much for me, that I should move to one of those senior villas near the lake. You know," she said, "my granddaughter tried to talk me into selling my house last April, said it was too big for one woman. Told me I should move into one of those fancy lakeside residences. You'll have company, meals, movie nights," she said. "And what did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her I'd rather die in a house full of chipped teacups and my own quiet than live in a place that smells of bleach and programmed laughter." I laughed then, really laughed. Not loud, but deep. The kind that comes from a part of the soul that's been asleep too long. Lorraine leaned closer. "You and I," she said, "we belong to a generation that knows what endurance costs. We bent our backs raising children who learn to measure love in gifts and treat gratitude as optional." I nodded, eyes on the window. The light was softening into that smoky hue that only October manages. "You're not cruel, Iris," she added gently. "People will say you are. They'll whisper you cut off your own blood, but they won't say you also kept them from drowning, even when no one asked whether you were sinking." I blinked, but no tears came. It wasn't that kind of ache anymore. We talked another hour, about her garden, the old maples in her yard, the squirrels that chewed through her gutter again. When she left, I hugged her longer than usual. She didn't say a word about it, and I was grateful. That night, I didn't turn on the television. Instead, I opened the drawer where I keep things too dear to throw away and too heavy to display. Inside was the letter Edward wrote to me years ago while working in Maine, its paper yellowed, the ink faded to the color of weak tea. "Iris, this house is never empty as long as you're in it. You are the roof, the frame, the lock on every door. No matter how quiet the world becomes, I'll always hear you." I read it 3 times before sliding it back into its envelope. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. Not anymore. It began simply the next morning, without any great resolve or planning. I decided to take a walk, not to deliver a casserole, not to pick up prescriptions, not to return a borrowed dish, just to walk. The October air was sharp, clean enough to sting a little, cold enough to wake the lungs but not the bones. I wore Edward's old windbreaker, one size too large, frayed at the cuffs. It still smelled faintly of sawdust and bay water. It felt like stepping back inside a memory that still fit. I walked slowly, not for exercise, but like someone taking inventory of what still belongs to them. House number 14 still had its blue-striped curtains. The Wilsons' porch swing still creaked in rhythm with time. I could almost hear Edward's voice somewhere inside my mind. We should fix ours before that one breaks, too. We never did. They didn't either. At the park, the old elm by the pond was still there, half split from lightning back in '99, scarred but standing. Its trunk leaned just enough to seem exhausted, but not defeated. I sat beneath it. The lake was still, a thin veil of mist floating over its surface. Two young mothers pushed strollers along the path, chatting about preschool and nap schedules. They didn't see me. I didn't mind. I wasn't invisible. I was simply outside their orbit, and that was enough. A woman in her 40s sat at the other end of the bench. She looked tired in the way working women often do, strong but slumped, her shoulders burdened by both lists and silence. We sat that way for a few minutes, sharing the kind of quiet that doesn't demand explanation. Then she spoke, eyes still fixed ahead. "Do you come here often?" "I used to," I said, "back when people still needed casseroles and rides to the clinic." She laughed softly. "Sounds familiar." "And you?" "I come here to breathe," she said. "Yesterday, my daughter told me she doesn't think she ever wants kids. She said she's not sure she sees the point." I tilted my head slightly. "What did you say?" "I told her I don't understand half her tattoos either," she said, smiling faintly. But I try to keep that thought to myself. I smiled too, the kind of quiet smile that feels like closing a circle. We sat for a while longer, two women in different chapters of the same story, one beginning to unlearn, the other remembering how. When I finally stood to leave, the light had changed again. The pond caught it like glass, and for a moment it looked as if the world itself had paused, just long enough to breathe with me. I turned toward home, the path crunching beneath my shoes, the smell of leaves sweet and damp in the cool air. Somewhere above, a flock of geese broke the sky open with sound, moving south in perfect formation. "But you didn't keep it to yourself, did you?" she asked. Her smile this time was unguarded, an honest curve that softened her whole face. "No," she said, "I didn't." We talked for another 15 minutes, about things that didn't matter, and the few that did. When she finally stood to leave, she waved once, a small, wordless farewell. I watched her walk away, her figure disappearing past the line of maple trees at the end of the path. Something inside my chest shifted, like an old door unsticking, opening a fraction for the first time in years. That night, I cooked dinner for myself. Not leftovers. Not something reheated from convenience. A real meal. I set the table properly, laid out the blue porcelain set Edward loved, lit a single candle. I turned on the old kitchen radio, tuned to the same station he used to listen to. They talk more than they play music now, but the static, the low hum, felt familiar. I ate slowly, not in loneliness, just in solitude. There's a difference. Loneliness is a void, solitude is a choice. Afterward, I walked into Edward's study. The air still smelled of old oak and paper, a ghost of pipe tobacco lingering in the corners. On his desk lay unfinished crossword puzzles, faded notes, a fountain pen dried mid-thought. I hadn't stepped inside for months. Tonight, I opened the window wide, letting the night breeze carry through. Dust lifted, drifted, settled again. I wiped the desk clean, straightened the books, then sat in his chair, the one that had molded itself to the shape of his back. And there, under the soft hum of crickets and radio static, I wrote myself a letter. It wasn't long. You are not invisible. You are not a burden. You do not have to trade peace for exhaustion. I folded it carefully, slipped it into the drawer beside Edward's final crossword, one column still blank. The clue read, "The end of one chapter, the start of another." I didn't need to fill it in. I was living the answer. 3 days later, a letter appeared in my mailbox. I knew the handwriting immediately. Tall, uneven capitals pressed too hard, as if every word had to leave a mark or risk being forgotten. Lucas always wrote that way, as though permanence could be achieved by pressure alone. The envelope was wedged between a credit card advertisement and a supermarket flyer. I brought it inside, set it on the counter, and watched it while the kettle boiled. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit there, the way I used to leave birthday cards unopened on the mantel, stretching out the pleasure of anticipation. When the tea was ready, I sat down, tore the envelope open carefully, and began to read. Dear Grandma, I wanted to write this instead of texting. I know I said some of this when I saw you, but I've been trying to find the right words. After a few days, I realized there aren't any perfect ones, so this is the truest thing I can say. Thank you. Not just for the Red Maple Trust, or the house, or the cabin by the bay, though I know those are incredible gifts, but for something else entirely. For being the only person in this family who never asked me to be anyone but myself. I paused, tracing the edge of the paper. His handwriting was strong, impatient, alive. You always gave me space. When my parents told me to be bolder, sharper, more strategic, you never did that. You just listened. I didn't know Grandpa was sick. I didn't know he was gone. I still don't know how to face it. And I'm sorry. I would have been there. You know that. I would have been there. I exhaled slowly. The candle beside me flickered, and a draft brushed against the page like breath. I'm angry at Mom for not telling me, for thinking it wasn't worth my time to know. I don't know why you chose me, but I promise I won't waste it. I want to take care of the house. I want to learn how you and Grandpa built everything, how you stayed standing when everyone else let go. I love you, Grandma. I don't say it enough, but I do, always. I read it 3 times. The first time, my eyes stayed dry. The second, my hand found its way to my chest. The third, the tears came. Quiet, unforced, like rain on warm pavement. I placed the letter on the mantel and stood there, watching it under the candlelight. In this house, letters like that were rare. Not because love was missing, but because for too long, no one had dared to write it down. The flame beside it wavered, bending toward the ink as if trying to read. And for a moment, I swore I could hear Edward's voice again, steady, amused, somewhere in the stillness. Told you, Iris, some things do come back. I smiled. Not the kind that fades quickly, but the kind that settles, lasting, somewhere deep where words can't reach. Outside, the wind rustled the last of the maple leaves. Inside, the candle burned low, throwing soft light across the letter, the porcelain plates, the quiet proof that I was never truly alone. It wasn't that love had disappeared. It had simply faded, worn thin by years of being assumed, stretched until it became routine. I no longer needed the money I had saved, not anymore. But I needed this, a small proof that some piece of my life, my patience, my quiet years, hadn't been swallowed by empty promises and decorative holidays. That night, I sat in Edward's chair, watching the silhouettes of maple branches shift across the floor as the last gold of evening drained away. Lucas was the kind of man Edward would have respected, steady, thoughtful, present. That last part, presence, has become the rarest virtue of all. Not just showing up, but truly seeing. I knew he wouldn't squander the Red Maple Trust, not because of its value, but because he understood what it meant to be forgotten. And those who've known neglect don't let anything wilt in silence. He would tend, he would remember. I closed my eyes and listened to the faint creak of the wood as the house adjusted to the night air. That sound used to make me feel lonely. Now it felt like the house itself was breathing, like the legacy was alive and exhaling. Evenings now have their own rhythm. No more messages from Elena asking if I could watch Lucas for an hour, not because she needed me, but because her yoga class ran late. No more emails from Richard wondering if I could advance a little for car repairs, never urgent enough to refuse, always just enough to make me feel guilty. Now the quiet had softened. That night I set the table for one, not out of loneliness, but because I finally understood the difference between eating and being nourished. I roasted a real chicken, not something frozen or microwaved. I made baked potatoes with rosemary I'd picked from the small patch in the garden, the same patch where Edward once bent down to tie the vines back when weekends still meant happiness, not scheduling. I lit a candle. It wasn't necessary, but I wanted to. Midway through the meal, the house was so still I could hear the pendulum clock ticking in the hallway. That clock had followed us since our first apartment in Portland, the one whose steady rhythm kept us awake at night when all we had were a few dollars and a vague promise that we'd be okay someday. He used to say, "We'll build something. Slowly, but it'll be ours." He was right. It was slow, and it was beautiful. After dinner, I washed each plate carefully, drying them one by one, not thinking about who might need this kitchen after me. When I put the last dish away, I did something I hadn't done in years. I danced. Not gracefully, not long, but enough. I turned on the record player, the same one Edward could never quite fix. He'd laugh, saying, "Leave it, the scratches make it real." He was right. The needle skipped through a few bars, and I still sang along. Barefoot in the living room, I lifted my hand, stumbled a little, smiled more. My knees reminded me I was 68. My heart reminded me I was 20. I danced like no one was watching, because for the first time, no one was. Not for comparison, not for approval, not to earn affection. Just me, in the home I kept, in the peace I fought for. I only stopped when my eyes fell on the fireplace, cold now, layered with dust, holding the gray remains of the last winter Edward was alive. I knelt, brushing away the ashes, clearing them gently as though performing a ritual. Beneath the soot, I found a small, folded scrap of paper tucked between the logs. The edges were browned, the ink faded, but familiar. "Keep dancing, even if it's just in the kitchen. The world will try to make you forget who you are. Don't let it." I sat there, my hands streaked with ash, eyes burning but dry. He had known. Maybe not what would happen, but what life would try to do. Shrink me, quiet me, make me obedient. But not anymore. The fire might have gone cold, but I could still feel its warmth in that note, in the air, in the pulse of my own heart. The house creaked again, this time softer, almost like applause. I leaned back on my heels, whispered into the silence, "I didn't forget, Edward." Outside, the moon lifted over Casco Bay, its reflection trembling across the dark water. Inside, a woman danced once more, her shadow moving with the light that never truly left. Edward had left that note like a map through the overgrown forest of my life. I sat on the rug, staring into the cold fireplace. Not empty, I corrected myself. Waiting. That night, I cracked the bedroom window just an inch. The autumn air drifted in, cool and sharp, carrying the smell of dried leaves and the faint salt of the bay. I lay beneath the quilt I'd stitched in 1984, back when Edward worked long hours, the kids were in school, and I still believed exhaustion was a form of virtue. Now I know peace is the truer measure. My body was tired, but not the old kind of tired. Not the heaviness of duty or the ache of expectation. This was the fatigue that follows reclamation, not of a crown, not of revenge, of a name, my own. I didn't expect to see her. When I opened the door, Elena stood there, alone, no car engine idling in the driveway, no Richard hovering behind her with some rehearsed apology. Just her, holding a store-bought pie in a plastic container from the bakery on Harbor Street. "Apple?" she said, forcing a small smile. I stepped aside. Not out of politeness or grace, only curiosity. She entered slowly, her eyes drifting across the hallway like a stranger retracing old territory. They landed on the photographs along the wall, the coat rack Edward had built in 1981, the one Richard broke a hook off as a boy and blamed the neighbor for. Edward never fixed it. "Now it's part of the story," he had said. Elena stood still in the kitchen. I didn't offer tea. I didn't say sit down. I let silence do the work. It stretched, heavy, but not cruel. Finally she spoke. "I didn't come to ask for anything." "Good," I said. She hesitated, her hands tightening on the edge of the counter. "I heard you changed everything. About the Red Maple Trust, the house, that you left it all to Lucas." I nodded. "I know you probably won't believe me," she continued, voice trembling slightly, "but I came to say thank you." I blinked, unsure I'd heard her right. "For what?" "For not giving it to Richard." I looked up, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw something real in her eyes. No gloss, no armor, just fatigue and truth. "Richard never learned to stand on his own," she said quietly. "He grew up thinking everything would be handled for him. I helped him keep that illusion, until I couldn't anymore." She drew a slow, shaking breath. "The way you enabled him didn't help, but neither did I. And now that's who he is." I said nothing. She went on. "He and Caroline both blame you, you know. They say you were controlling, impossible. But what they never say is that you were the one keeping everything from collapsing while they complained about how hard it was to live under your roof." I crossed my arms, leaning lightly against the counter. "And you're telling me this because I'm tired," she whispered. We stood there for a long moment, the kitchen caught in its own quiet orbit. The hallway clock ticked somewhere behind us, slow and steady. The pie sat untouched between us, the scent of cinnamon faint in the air. Finally, she pulled out a chair and sat down. "I always admired Edward," she said softly. "He was kind, even when there was no reason to be." Her voice thinned. "And I never thanked you. For the help. For watching Lucas. For always being there." I looked at her steadily. "You don't owe me gratitude," I said. "But you owed him your presence at the end. And you didn't come." She nodded, her eyes glistening but dry. "I know." The words didn't bring me satisfaction. Only a calm finality, like dust brushed from a windowsill. From her bag she pulled a small photograph, its edges frayed. Lucas, maybe 5 years old, sitting on the old backyard swing. I'd taken that picture one April Sunday, long before the fights, before the distance. Perhaps she'd cut it from an old Christmas card. She placed it on the table between us. "He loves you," she said softly. "You know that, don't you?" I nodded. "He talks about you like you're the only person who ever really listened." Her voice faltered, and for a moment she looked younger, stripped of the polish and calculation I'd come to expect. Just a daughter standing in her mother's kitchen, trying to say something she should have said years ago. "I don't expect forgiveness," she whispered. "I just wanted you to know I see it now. All of it. What you carried. What you held up." The clock chimed 6. The sound echoed through the hallway like a soft verdict. I looked at her and saw a woman built from the same mix of strength and denial that had once lived in me, and I thought, maybe this too was part of the story Edward meant to leave unfinished. "Take a slice," I said finally, nodding at the pie. She blinked, startled, then smiled faintly. "It's not homemade." "I know," I replied, "but it's something." We ate in silence, 2 women chewing through the brittle crust of years. When she left, she paused at the door. "Lucas will do right by it," she said quietly. "I know," I answered. She hesitated, then added, "He gets that from you." When the door closed, I stood there, listening to her footsteps fade down the gravel drive, until all that remained was the night wind and the steady ticking of the clock. I turned off the kitchen light, leaving the pie half-finished on the counter. The air smelled of apples and wood smoke. I walked to the window, pulled the curtain slightly aside. The sky over Casco Bay was pale and clean, the kind of stillness that feels earned. I hope someday he loves someone like that, Elena said softly, her voice gentler now, stripped of its sharp edges. And I hope he knows how rare it is. She smoothed her coat, gathering herself back into composure. I won't take up more of your time, she continued, but I needed to say this before the story gets rewritten, before they turn you into the villain in their version. She walked to the door and opened it herself. A gust of wind slipped in, lifting the edge of her scarf. For a moment, she looked younger, less painted. Simply a woman who had spent her life giving more than she was ever truly seen for. She paused at the threshold. Don't let them take your peace, Iris, she said. They've taken enough. Then she left. I stood there for a long while before picking up the apple pie and sliding it into the refrigerator. Not out of sentimentality, just practicality. It would taste better with tea in the morning. A week later, a letter arrived from my lawyer. Not urgent, not dramatic, simply confirmation. The filings were complete. The Red Maple Trust was now official. Lucas's name appeared on every document, every account, in the exact spaces where Richard's and Caroline's had once been. The feeling wasn't triumph. It wasn't pride. It was quiet closure, like a book that had been left open too long finally finding its last page. I carried the envelope out to the garden. The late lavender was fading, drooping under the early frost. I heard Edward's voice in my mind. They surrender with dignity. I smiled. Now I understood. There is a way to let go without losing. Sitting on the old wooden bench, I ran my fingers over the envelope. Everything was real now. Not just a set of actions born from grief or anger, but something settled, absorbed into the walls, the soil, into me. I had done what needed to be done, and strangely, what I felt wasn't relief or victory. It was permission. Permission to begin again, even in the smallest ways. That afternoon I took out the sewing machine. It had been tucked away since Edward fell ill. I cleared the table, oiled the gears, threaded the needle carefully, the way my mother once taught me. I wasn't making anything grand. I just wanted to hear that sound again, the soft hum that belonged to women who kept going no matter how much they carried. I sewed new curtains for the kitchen. They didn't match anything, bright blue with crooked white stitching, but they were mine. The next morning I rose early and made pancakes. Real ones, from scratch, not from a mix. I set 2 plates. I knew Lucas would come. He always kept his word. Sure enough, at 9 sharp, I heard the car door close and the front steps creak. He appeared at the doorway, holding a grocery bag I hadn't asked for. "Thought you might want a few fresh things," he said. I smiled. "Would you like to learn how to make pancakes?" He grinned. "Absolutely." We cooked together. I showed him how to flip them without tearing, how to test the pan with a drop of water, how to mix the batter gently so the air stayed in. He listened carefully, really listened. Not the distracted way Richard used to, always rushing, always cutting corners. "These are good," he said, taking a bite of the first one. "You get better with years of practice," I replied. He poured more syrup, laughing so wide his dimples showed. "You know, I think this place could be something." "This place?" I asked. "The house," he said. "Not just to keep it, but to use it. Maybe turn it into something for people who need a second start. Or a workshop. Teach folks how to garden, to cook, to build something with their own hands." Something inside me shifted open, not loudly, but like light creeping under a door. Hope, quiet and sure. "Your grandfather would love that idea," I said. He nodded. "Maybe I'll start with the porch. It needs some fixing." "You'll need real tools for that," I said. He smiled. "And a real teacher." The words settled between us, warm as the kitchen air, soft as the morning light spilling through my uneven curtains. He looked around the kitchen, his gaze landing on the record player, the quilt folded over the chair, the single candle still half burned from the night before. "You've changed this place," he said. I shook my head. "No, I just let it breathe again." Outside, the bay shimmered under a pale October sun. The wind brushed through the lavender, the sound of surrender and renewal mingling in the air. Lucas washed the dishes while I refilled the kettle. The water hissed as it met the metal. For the first time in years, the house felt full, not of people, but of presence. When he was done, he reached for his coat. "I'll bring the tools next time," he said. "I'll have the tea ready," I answered. He smiled, kissed my cheek, and stepped out into the crisp morning. I stood by the window and watched him walk down the path lined with fallen leaves. He paused at the gate, turned back and waved, the same way Edward used to. I waved back, my hands steady, my heart quiet. "Not the kind from a plastic toolkit," Lucas said, laughing as he looked up. "Guess you'll have to teach me that too." We finished breakfast in a quiet that felt full rather than empty. When he left, I stood by the sink, the new blue curtains trembling lightly at the open window. The wind carried the scent of dry leaves and something faintly sweet, maybe cinnamon, maybe memory. I looked out across the yard. The lavender bushes were thin now, the wooden bench slick with frost, the old maple stripped bare but still upright. For the first time since the funeral, I felt no weight pressing on my shoulders, only the shape of what was coming, something Lucas would build, something I had cleared space for. The first snow fell, thin, bright, barely touching the ground, the kind of snow that doesn't settle, only announces that the season has changed. I stood on the back porch, wrapped in a thick cardigan, a mug of coffee warming my hands. Lucas was at the front, measuring the porch rail with a spirit level, murmuring to himself the way Edward used to. It had been a month since I'd signed the papers. No miracles, no fireworks. Just a quiet shift inside me. The weight of decades of promises, roles, expectations had finally lifted. What replaced it wasn't anger or triumph. It was space. Space for something new to grow. Richard and Caroline didn't call. Elena sent a message. "I hope you're proud of what you did." I didn't reply. Richard's silence was deeper, like an absence that no longer required filling. I didn't chase it. They would rewrite the story in their own colors, the ones that let them sleep at night. Everyone does, eventually. But I knew the truth. I knew what I gave and what I reclaimed. Truth doesn't shout. It simply stands. Lucas knocked softly at the back door. "Grandma, want to see the new railing?" I set my cup down and followed him. He had done well. The wood was sanded, stained, sealed with care. For the first time in years, the porch looked loved again. "Edward would say it leans a little to the left," I said, smiling. Lucas laughed. "Everyone in this family does." The sound that escaped me was a real laugh, round and full, the kind that hadn't touched my throat in years. He stood beside me, wiping his hands on a rag, eyes squinting against the wind. I was thinking maybe in spring I could start a garden out front. Not just flowers, herbs, vegetables, something alive. I looked at him, not the boy I once lulled to sleep, but a man who understood how to be present. "Sounds right to me," I said. We went back inside as the cold began to seep in. I made soup. He fixed the squeaky cabinet door. I showed him where the circuit breaker was. He asked about the insulation in the attic. We filled the day with small things, the kind no one photographs but that keep a life together. When he left, I sat down at my desk and wrote one more letter. Not to the lawyer, not to the court. To myself, to the woman I once was. You tried too long, bent yourself into shapes that never fit, spoke softly when you should have stood tall, gave when you should have said no, but you also loved with everything you had, and that was not a mistake. Now you are free. Free to dance in the kitchen, to plant things just to see them grow, to say no without guilt, to say yes without fear, to give when it's right, not when it's demanded. You are not cruel. You are not bitter. You are clear. And at last, that is enough. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the old photographs. Not to hide it, just to know it was there, like a small lighthouse I'd built myself. Before bed, I stepped outside once more. The sky was clear, the stars cold and sharp. I looked up and whispered, "You'd be proud, Ed. Not for the choices, not for the strength, but because at last I'd chosen peace, not loud, not public, just mine. The wind moved through the maples, soft and steady. Somewhere inside the house, the old clock began to chime. So, this is what I want to leave with you. You, who have stayed until now. Maybe you carry your own quiet corners, rooms inside your heart that haven't been tidied in years, boundaries you've never dared to name. Don't wait for anyone to hand you peace. Choose it. Don't mistake love for obligation. Don't mistake loyalty for worth. And if your house has become so loud that no one truly hears you anymore, create a new kind of silence. The kind that doesn't shrink you just so you can stay. The kind where silence isn't surrender. It's freedom. Because peace isn't something people grant you when they're ready. It's something you build when you finally are. If your days have been filled with noise that drowns out your name, step back. Close the door gently. Breathe. You don't owe anyone your exhaustion. You owe yourself your return. Maybe your life, like mine, has gathered a few cracks. Old promises, tired rooms, walls that have seen too much waiting. But cracks let the light in, light. And sometimes, that's all it takes for everything to start growing again. I can't tell you when that shift will happen, when the weight will ease, when the breath will steady. But one morning, you'll pour your coffee, look out the same window, and realize that peace didn't arrive. You made it. If this story found a truth in you, keep it, or share it, or simply let it rest beside you, a small reminder that it is never too late to come home to yourself. Follow for more stories like this one. And if something here echoed in you, leave a comment, or just sit with it in your own quiet. I promise, that's enough.